Hey there, ready to dive deep. This time we're looking into those large language models that are making headlines these days. Yeah.
Yeah,
BERT GPT-3, even that trillion parameter switch C,
huge.
they're trained on mountains of data. But the question is, are they actually understanding language?
Right.
Or are they just really good at mimicking it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's something
Yeah.
that a lot of people are debating right now.
Well, we have this fascinating article here
Yeah.
on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? And this is what we're going to use to kind of unpack this whole idea.
Yeah, it's a provocative title for sure.
Yeah, so stochastic parrots, what a striking image.
Definitely gets you thinking.
Yeah. So we're talking about models trained on these enormous data sets, right? Sometimes they're scraped from the entire internet.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of the data is mind-boggling.
But this article makes the point that just having a ton of data doesn't necessarily mean you have diverse or accurate data.
Right, and that's a key point. It connects to one of the big concerns raised in the paper, the environmental cost of all this big data.
Okay, so how so?
Well, training these models is computationally expensive. It requires massive amounts of energy.
Like how much are we talking here?
The authors compare the energy use of training a single BERT model to a trans-American flight.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is a hefty carbon footprint for just one model.
Yeah. So what are the implications of that? I mean, we're all data scientists here. We understand that computational power has its costs.
Yeah,
But is this something we should be concerned about?
absolutely. The paper argues that researchers really need to prioritize energy efficiency
Okay.
and consider the long-term cost of inference, not just the energy it takes to train the model,
Right.
but also how much energy it uses every time it's actually deployed and making predictions.
Oh, I see.
And this is where the social implications come into play.
Okay.
Marginalized communities who are already disproportionately affected by climate change are less likely to benefit from these large language models and more likely to bear the brunt of the environmental consequences of their development.
That's a really good point. It's almost like we're building these powerful tools, but the cost of building them falls on those who might benefit the least.
Yeah, it's a real concern.
And it makes me think about another point the paper raises, how diverse these massive data sets actually are. I mean, we might assume that scraping data from the entire internet would give you a pretty good sample of humanity, but is that really the case?
Well, not necessarily. The authors argue that the internet, while vast, is not a neutral representation of humanity.
What?
The data that's scraped to train these models can actually reflect and even amplify existing biases.
Can you give us an example of how that might happen?
Sure. Think about who contributes to online content,
Right.
what gets moderated on different platforms,
Yeah.
and what data is ultimately chosen for training. All of those factors play a role in shaping the model's output. The paper uses the example of GPT-2, which was trained on data from Reddit, a platform with a pretty noticeable demographic skew towards young men.
Yeah, that's true.
So if your model is learning from a data set that's mostly created by one particular demographic, you're not going to get a balanced view of the world.
It makes sense. You're training your model on a skewed sample, so you're likely to get skewed results. The article also talks about filtering processes
Right.
and how even those can introduce bias.
Yeah, the authors studied a large data set that had been filtered by removing pages containing certain bad words.
To clean it up.
Yeah, while the intention was to filter out offensive content, it's likely that the process also ended up removing content from certain communities and narrowing the diversity of the data set.
So even seemingly neutral choices about data collection and cleaning can actually introduce bias.
Exactly. And here's another layer to consider. Language is constantly evolving.
Oh, that's true.
Social movements, for example, introduce new words and new ways of framing issues.
Like the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, that's a great example. It had a huge impact on the way people talked about race and social justice online.
Right.
But if a language model is trained on data from before a movement like that, it wouldn't accurately represent those new ideas in that new language. Essentially, even a massive data set is like a snapshot in time, and language and culture are always changing.
So even if you have a huge data set, it doesn't mean you have the full picture.
Yeah,
It's pretty fascinating,
it is.
especially given the cost and resources needed to train these models. It's not practical to constantly retrain them every time there's a cultural shift or a new slang term emerges.
That's right. So you could end up with a model that's technically fluent but stuck in the past.
Wow.
And that leads us to another crucial point raised by the authors, the encoding of bias. Because large language models are trained on such massive amounts of data, they inevitably absorb and amplify the biases that exist in that data.
We've touched on this in the context of data selection, But can you give us some more specific examples of how this bias actually shows up in the models themselves?
Sure, there's been a lot of research on this, and some of the findings are pretty concerning. For example, studies have shown that BERT, one of the most popular large language models, tends to associate phrases referencing persons with disabilities with more negative sentiment words.
So it's picking up on the subtle and not so subtle biases that exist in the data it's been trained on. It's almost like these models are holding up a mirror to our own societal biases.
That's a good way to put it, and it raises a critical question: how do we actually measure and audit these biases?
Yeah, how do we do that?
The paper points out that some of the tools we currently use to assess bias, like sentiment analysis algorithms, might themselves be biased, which makes the whole process even more complex.
It's like using a wonky measuring stick.
Exactly.
You might get a reading, but you can't be sure if it's accurate.
Right, and it's not just about individual biases either. The paper discusses the concept of intersectionality, which is the idea that people can experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously.
So someone might face discrimination based on their race and their gender, for example.
Right. And the research suggests that large language models can actually compound these biases, meaning they can be even more biased against individuals who are marginalized along multiple axes.
That's a sobering thought. So it's not just that these models are reflecting societal biases, they're potentially making those biases even worse. It makes the call for a new approach even more urgent, doesn't it?
It really does. The authors argue that we need to move away from simply chasing bigger and bigger data sets and focus more on careful curation and documentation of the data we're using.
Quality over quantity.
Yes, and transparency.
Yeah.
We need to be more intentional about what we're feeding these models and be upfront about the potential limitations and biases they might have.
It seems like the message is slow down, think critically, and consider the ethical implications before releasing a massive language model into the wild.
Exactly. And that leads us to another fascinating aspect of this discussion: the illusion of understanding.
The illusion of understanding. Tell me more about that.
Well, the paper argues that just because these models can produce human quality text doesn't mean they truly comprehend it. Okay. They might be manipulating linguistic forms without actual access to the meaning behind those forms. They refer to them as stochastic parrots.
So they can mimic human language without actually understanding what they're saying. It's a pretty apt metaphor.
Yeah.
But why do we fall for the illusion? Why do we assume that just because a machine can string words together in a grammatically correct way, it must be thinking and understanding like a human?
Well, it's a very human tendency. Our brains are wired to look for patterns and meaning. So when we see a machine generating text that resembles human language, we tend to assume there's a mind behind it, even when there isn't.
It's kind of like those optical illusions where you see a face in a random pattern.
Yeah.
Our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, even when there's no real meaning there.
That's a great comparison.
Hmm.
And this tendency to project meaning onto machines is even stronger when it comes to language. Language is so fundamental to our human experience. It's hard to imagine a machine using language without understanding it.
But that misunderstanding, that tendency to attribute meaning where there is none, can have real-world consequences, can't it?
Absolutely. That's where the risks associated with these large language models come into sharp focus.
Okay, so let's explore those risks. What kind of harm could arise from deploying these models without fully understanding their limitations?
One major risk is what's called automation bias,
Okay.
the tendency to over-rely on automated systems even when they're wrong.
So we might start trusting the output of these models too much, even when they're just generating nonsense.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where a large language model is being used to generate legal documents or medical diagnoses. If we blindly trust the model's output without any human oversight, we could end up with serious errors that have real-world consequences.
And what about malicious use?
Yeah,
Did someone intentionally use these models to cause harm?
absolutely. The paper gives the example of GPT-3 being used to create incredibly convincing extremist propaganda.
Because it's so good with language.
Exactly. It can tailor its language to specific audiences.
So it's not just about the model being biased. It's about the model being used as a tool for manipulation and spreading misinformation.
Exactly. And because these models can produce so much text so rapidly, they could easily be used to flood social media with propaganda, making it harder to distinguish truth from fiction. It's a serious concern.
And I imagine that this fluency and coherence also makes these models incredibly effective for things like phishing scams or other types of social engineering.
You're absolutely right. If you get an email that sounds like it's from your bank or a friend, but it was actually generated by a language model, you're more likely to fall for it. These models are really blurring the lines between human and machine communication.
It's both fascinating and a bit unsettling.
Definitely. And then there's a question of privacy. Because these models are trained on such massive data sets, they can sometimes memorize and reproduce sensitive information, like phone numbers or addresses.
Wait, so you're saying someone could potentially extract personal information from these
Yep.
models?
It is a possibility. The authors actually demonstrate a technique for extracting personally identifiable information from a large language model, highlighting the need for better security measures.
That is concerning.
Mm.
We can't just assume that publicly available data is fair game for a language model to learn and potentially expose.
Mhm.
We need robust privacy safeguards in place.
I agree. And all of these risks, bias, disinformation, privacy violations raise the question of accountability. If a large language model causes harm, who is responsible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Who is responsible?
It's a tricky question because these models are essentially autonomous systems that generate text without human intervention. It becomes difficult to assign blame when something goes wrong.
That is tricky.
That's the challenge, and the paper argues that we need a shift in focus, a move away from simply making these models bigger and more powerful and towards a deeper understanding of how they work, their limitations, and the potential consequences of their use.
So it sounds like we need to stop thinking about them as just impressive feats of engineering and start thinking about them as tools with a real impact on people and on society.
Exactly. And that impact can be both positive and negative.
Right.
We have to make sure we're guiding these technologies in a direction that ultimately benefits humanity.
I think that's a great point to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this first segment. Everything from the environmental cost of large language models to the risks of bias and the potential for misuse. In the next segment, we'll dig into some potential solutions and paths forward for addressing these issues. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on the question. As data scientists working with these powerful tools, how can we ensure that we're building technology that's fair, ethical, and truly beneficial?
That's an important question for all of us to consider. We have a responsibility to think critically about the impact of our work and to use our expertise to create a better future. So we've uncovered some pretty serious concerns with these large language models, but it's not all doom and gloom. The paper also outlines some potential paths forward, ways to mitigate the risks and steer these powerful technologies in a more responsible direction.
Okay, I'm all ears. What concrete steps can we take to avoid these potential dangers?
Well, the paper really emphasizes the importance of careful planning and forethought. Before we even start building these models, we need to ask ourselves some tough questions.
Like what?
Well, what are the potential benefits and harms?
Okay,
Who are the stakeholders?
right.
What are the environmental costs?
So it seems like they're advocating for a more holistic view of development, considering the broader societal impact from the get-go.
Precisely. It's about taking a more ethical approach, considering all the angles from the outset. And a key aspect of that is the data itself. Instead of just indiscriminately gathering huge amounts of data from the internet,
Right.
we need to be more deliberate about the data we use to train these models.
So back to that idea of quality over quantity.
Yeah.
But how do we actually ensure that the data we're using is diverse representative and free from harmful biases?
That's where curation comes in. The paper strongly advocates for investing significant resources in curating and documenting training data,
Okay.
carefully selecting data sources, understanding the inherent biases and limitations of those sources,
Right.
and meticulously documenting the entire process.
So it's not just about getting the data, it's about understanding the data, its origins and its potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. We need to be data detectives, tracing the provenance of our data and making sure it's truly fit for purpose.
But even with careful curation, we can't entirely eliminate bias, can we?
That's true.
I mean, language itself carries cultural assumptions and historical baggage.
Yeah, that's true. But by being mindful of those biases and actively seeking out data that represents a broader range of perspectives, we can at least try to mitigate the potential for harm.
Okay. The paper also stresses the importance of documentation.
Yeah.
Why is that so crucial?
Well, documentation is essential for accountability. If we have a clear record of where our data came from, how it was collected, and what biases it might contain, we're in a much better position to identify and address any harm that might arise from the model.
So it's like having a detailed recipe for the model. Anyone who wants to understand how it works and what went into it can trace it all back.
Exactly. Transparency is key.
Okay.
And this documentation should also include information about the model's intended use cases, right?
Right. We need to be crystal clear about what tasks the model is designed for and what it's not suitable for. No more deploying a language model to write medical prescriptions, I hope.
Exactly. We need to clearly define the boundaries and consider the potential for misuse.
Like how? What do you mean?
Well, what if someone tries to use our model to generate hate speech or spread misinformation?
Oh, right. That's a tough one. It's like trying to predict all the ways someone might misuse a hammer.
It is a challenge, but we have to face it head on.
Hmm.
We need to anticipate potential vulnerabilities and build in safeguards to prevent misuse.
Okay. The paper also mentions the concept of value-sensitive design. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Sure, value-sensitive design is a framework for building technology that aligns with human values, identifying stakeholders, understanding their values, and designing systems that genuinely support those values.
So it's not just about building a technically functional system. It's about building something that works for people and respects their values and needs.
Precisely. And in the context of large language models, value-sensitive design can be a powerful tool for addressing issues like bias privacy and accountability.
Can you give an example of how that might work in practice?
Sure, for instance, if we're developing a chatbot for customer service, we need to make sure it treats all customers fairly, regardless of their background or personal characteristics.
Right, makes sense.
And we need to be incredibly mindful of privacy. We shouldn't collect or store more data than absolutely necessary. And we need to ensure that data is protected.
Okay. The paper also calls for a shift in research focus. Instead of just making models bigger, what do the authors suggest we prioritize?
They urge us to focus on understanding how these models actually work, how they learn, and why they make the decisions they make.
So rather than just being impressed by the superficial fluency, we need to look under the hood and figure out the mechanisms at play.
Right. We need to move beyond the black box mentality and develop better tools for interpreting and explaining these models.
This all sounds promising, but what about practicality? These approaches like curation and value-sensitive design, they require a lot of time, effort, and resources.
True, they do, but the potential harms of these large language models are far too significant to ignore. We can't afford not to invest in these approaches.
Yeah, that's a good point. It feels like we're at a crucial crossroads in the development of this technology. We can either continue down the path of unfettered growth, risking unintended and potentially disastrous consequences, or we can choose a more deliberate, more ethical path.
And that choice ultimately rests with us.
It's a powerful reminder that we have a responsibility to shape the future of this technology. What concrete actions can researchers and developers take right now to start implementing these recommendations?
Well, one very practical step is to start using datasheets and model cards. These are standardized documents that provide comprehensive information about datasets and models,
Okay.
including their intended use cases, limitations, and potential biases.
So it's like providing a fact sheet for the model, a way to be transparent about its strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. By making this information readily available, we can promote greater transparency and accountability in the field.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The paper also suggests conducting what they call pre-mortem analyses. What are those?
A premortem is a technique borrowed from the business world. It involves imagining that your project has failed and then working backward to identify potential causes.
So it's like a thought experiment,
Yeah,
a way to anticipate problems before they arise.
exactly. And by doing this early in the development process, we can identify and mitigate potential risks.
These all sound like very practical and actionable steps. Are there any tools or resources out there to help researchers and developers implement these approaches?
There's a growing number of resources available, and more are being developed all the time. For example, there are open source tools for detecting and mitigating bias in datasets and models.
That's encouraging. Yeah. It sounds like the field is beginning to take these ethical considerations more seriously.
Definitely. There's a growing awareness of these issues, which is a positive sign. But there's still a lot of work to do. We need to continue developing new tools, techniques, and best practices for building and deploying these models responsibly.
And just as importantly, we need to foster a culture of ethical awareness and responsibility within the field.
Absolutely. We have to move beyond the move fast and break things mentality and embrace a more thoughtful and deliberate approach to innovation.
It really does feel like we're navigating uncharted territory. These large language models are such powerful tools. But with that power comes significant risk. We need to proceed with caution and a strong sense of responsibility.
I agree. And I think it's crucial to remember that these technologies aren't just about algorithms and code. They're about people, about how we communicate, how we understand the world, and how we relate to each other.
At the end of the day, our goal should be to use these technologies to enhance human connection and understanding, not to diminish or distort them.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I think it captures the essence of what this paper is calling for, a more human-centered approach to AI.
As we wrap up this segment, I want to leave you with a question. How can you, in your own work, contribute to the responsible development and deployment of these models? How can you ensure that the technologies you create are aligned with human values and contribute to a more just and equitable society?
Those are powerful questions, and
Mhm.
I hope they inspire some deep reflection. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of this technology, and I believe that together we can build a future where AI empowers humanity rather than endangering it.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the downsides of large language models, but it's important to remember that they have enormous potential for good too.
Oh, absolutely.
So how can we harness that power without, falling into those traps we've been discussing?
That's the key question, isn't it? I mean, every new technology comes with its own set of challenges and opportunities.
Right.
One area where large language models show real promise is in accessibility.
Okay. How so?
Well, think about automatic speech recognition, for example.
Hmm.
The advances in language modeling have really led to some impressive improvements in those systems.
Yeah.
And those improvements can have a huge impact on people who are deaf or hard of hearing.
I see what you mean. Providing real-time captioning for live events or generating transcripts of audio recordings could make a lot of content more accessible.
Exactly. And it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
Improved speech recognition can also help people with disabilities that affect their speech or motor skills. It can allow them to communicate more effectively.
Those are really powerful examples of how these technologies can be used to break down barriers and empower people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But even when we're talking about applications with clear benefits like this, the paper still urges caution. They talk about this idea of the dual use problem. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure, dual use basically highlights the fact that any technology can be used for good or for bad.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's like a hammer can be used to build a house or it can be used as a weapon.
Right. So even if a large language model is being used for something positive, like improving accessibility, we still have to consider the possibility that it could be used for something harmful.
Exactly. We
Yeah.
can't just ignore that possibility.
So how do we address that? I mean, how do we maximize the benefits while minimizing the potential for harm?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The paper offers a few strategies. One that I found particularly interesting is the idea of watermarking.
Watermarking. Okay, tell me more.
So the idea is to embed a sort of secret code into any text that's generated by a language model.
Okay.
This code would distinguish it from human-generated text. It'd be like a digital fingerprint.
Oh, I see. So you could trace the text back to its source and potentially flag or filter content that might be harmful.
Exactly, that's the idea.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
Are there any other approaches out there that could help us navigate this dual-use dilemma?
Another approach is to move away from developing these general-purpose language models and focus instead on building models that are tailored for very specific tasks, like translation or education or healthcare.
So instead of having one model that tries to do everything, we'd have specialized models for specific jobs.
Precisely. And by narrowing the scope of the model in that way, you reduce the risk of it being misused.
That makes a lot of sense. We've talked a lot about technical approaches to these challenges, but what about the role of policy and regulation? Can we really rely on technology alone to solve these ethical problems?
Technology is definitely a big part of the solution, but it's not the whole picture.
Hmm.
We also need to think about things like policy and regulation guidelines that can help steer the development of these technologies in a responsible direction.
Okay, so what might those policies or regulations look like?
Well, one idea is to require companies and researchers to conduct ethical impact assessments before they release a new language model.
Kind of like an environmental impact assessment, but for ethics.
Exactly. And these assessments would need to consider a wide range of factors like potential biases, privacy risks, the potential for misuse. They'd have to take a really comprehensive look at the possible consequences.
It sounds like we're talking about a multifaceted approach here, combining technical solutions with ethical guidelines and thoughtful policy interventions.
It's definitely not a simple problem. It's going to require a collaborative effort. Researchers, developers, policymakers, even the public will need to work together to find the right solutions.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's clear that these large language models have the potential to reshape our world, but we need to be incredibly mindful of the risks involved.
I agree. We need to approach these technologies with caution and a strong sense of responsibility.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from the environmental cost to the risks of bias and the potential for misuse. But I think the most important takeaway is that we all have a responsibility to make sure that these powerful technologies are used for good.
Absolutely. The future of AI really depends on our ability to make wise and ethical choices.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of large language models.
That's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, stay curious, stay engaged, and let's keep working together to build a better future with AI.